Welcome, everyone, to the P.A.S. Report podcast. This is your host, Nick Giordano. I want to thank you for joining me. Please visit the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com. Also, make sure to follow and subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. I have a great guest today. I have Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. He is one of the most prolific historians, in our country, that's for sure. And he has a new book coming out May 7th. You can pre-order it, The End of Everything, How Wars Descend to Annihilation. Got an advanced copy, started reading it. So far, it's got me fascinated, and there's a lot of elements in there. Dr. Hanson, welcome back to the PAS Report. How are you today?
Very good. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's always a pleasure. And I do want to get to your book. But first, I saw an article you wrote, Guilty But Not Really Guilty, where you highlight and outline the abuses of power that we've witnessed for the last decade, at the very least, and how some in this country get a different tier of justice than others, as we're witnessing. So can you just explain to the audience about the government abuses that have occurred over the years?
Well, I think we had an asymmetry in our administrative state and in the judicial system, but for the last decade, and that's roughly the period when Donald Trump announced his candidacy in 2015, we've seen a radical departure from the idea of blind justice and equal justice under the law. And what I mean by that is, if you look at, say, Michael Flynn, whose career was destroyed by allegedly lying to the FBI, then you look at the FBI interim director, Andrew McCabe, who lied 4 times under oath to federal investigators, and he was not even prosecuted. Or James Comey, the FBI director, who said he could not remember 245 times under oath to the House Intelligence Committee when he was interrogated about leaking a private, probably classified document that memorialized a private conversation with the president. He leaked it to a third party, the New York Times. He was not prosecuted. And then you look at John Brennan, CIA director, James Clapper, head of director of national intelligence. Both of them admitted that they lied under oath to Congress. No prosecution. If you look at Eric Holder, that defied a congressional subpoena concerning Fast and Furious scandal, or you look at Hunter Biden's most recent initial refusal to go before a House committee, and then you look at Peter Navarro, who felt that the January 6th House committee was rigged, he thought, because it was the first time that the speaker had overruled the minority leader's nomination, so he didn't show up. Now he's in jail as we speak. You look at Donald Trump, and there are twin special prosecutors, Robert Hur and James Jack Smith, and I don't see any differences in the cases, except Joe Biden admitted that he didn't take the documents out for 2 years, but 40 years, going back to his initial Senate. He didn't put it in one location. He may have put it 4 or 5 locations. Anybody who looks at the pictures in Mr. Hur's report and sees those dilapidated boxes in the garage compared to Mar-a-Lago with a security gate knows that they were better secured than Mar-a-Lago. And the only difference we were told was that Joe Biden cooperated with authorities in a way that Donald Trump did not. But according to Mr. Hur's report, in 2017, Joe Biden casually remarked to his ghostwriter, who had no security clearances, "Oh, by the way, the material here is classified." But he waited 6 years to come forward and tell the authorities. And he only came forward because the special counsel Smith was appointed by his own DOJ, and they were going to investigate Donald Trump. And they were worried that it would be, I don't know, embarrassing that he had done the same thing they were investigating. So suddenly he comes forward, and then they call that cooperation. And you could go on, but it's again and again and again. It goes from the fundamental to the banal. We have Jean Caroll, can't remember when the so-called assault took place, says she can remember the dress, but the dress didn't exist. Much of her narrative was the same plot in a Law and Order episode. It goes on. And Donald Trump is fined $83 million for defamation. And then we had Tara Reade, who almost at the same time says she was sexually assaulted by Joe Biden as a Senate aide. And people at the time remarked that she had told him that. In fact, her mother called up a Larry King talk show and said, "My daughter's been assaulted by a prominent senator." And there was no ramification. This is not even getting into people who had complained about Joe Biden blowing on their daughter's hair or nibbling them or all of that stuff that he apologized for in 2000. And so I could go on, but you get the impression that it's the ideology or the political affiliations that govern whether the administrative state or the court system use the full force of the law. I guess we'd call it lawfare.
Yeah, and I think the E. Jean Carroll thing really speaks volumes. A lot of people don't know, but she actually worked hand in hand with the New York State Legislature to remove the statute of limitations for
She
only
did.
6 months
I
to
know it.
bring the case. And once the case was brought, the statute, then the law expired, and now people can
Yeah,
sue.
it was like a bill of attainder. It's prohibited in the Constitution. Remember that the legislator who did that 4 years earlier had also introduced a special law into the New York legislature saying that the New York uh, legislature and state would turn over to any federal committee the private tax returns of anybody that was under subpoena by a federal congressional committee, and that was just written for Donald Trump, and that's how they got his tax records, which then they subsequently at the federal level leaked. But they got it through this special bill that was introduced by the same state legislature who did the exemption for E. Jean Carroll. And as soon as that bill was passed, she refiled, even though the statute of limitations otherwise would have been precluded that. And then remember that she also wrote an app about how to break up couples. And then she had also tweeted in 2015 on the announcement of Donald Trump's candidacy that was her favorite show was The Apprentice, and Donald Trump was one of her favorite media people. And I watched the Law and Order episode, and it was uncanny. It's in the same Bergendorf store. It's the same lingerie section. It's the same idea of a dressing room. It's the same powerful person, and it suggested either she suggested that based on her own experience, which I doubt, or she saw that in 2012 and then developed that narrative. But that was a travesty of justice. And then, of course, the judge Cohen characterized that as a rape, even though she was never convicted of rape, as Stephanopoulos just learned on ABC's interview. He said it was a sexual assault. That was what the jury found, and that was a defamation suit. But he said, well, it was almost equivalent to a rape. That was the judge himself said that, and that's what gave, I guess, Stephanopoulos the idea that it was a rape, but it wasn't. He was acquitted of rape.
And so we see these double standards in place. We see the way they justify it is that, Trump's the next Hitler. So it's
Yes.
okay to use every every tool of government to take him down. Has there ever been a case in American history where all the levers of power were used to take down one person? Do you know of any examples that we could equate this to?
Well, in the Roosevelt administration, some of the people who were in the America First that were isolationist, maybe even anti-Semitic, some of them, like Charles Lindbergh, for example. FDR went out of his way to make sure that Lindbergh was ostracized and would not be called up to serve in the armed forces. And he did. He was a consultant in the Pacific Theater, but it was private and under the radar, so to speak. So they used the power of government to go after him. And there were people in the New York Times at that time that were not so left-wing, and they had been writing things critical of FDR. And FDR said, if you don't cease this, we're going to pass legislation with a special inheritance tax for this newspaper. So it's happened in the past, but it was very rare. And I don't think it reached a magnitude of what we see now of trying to remove him from a ballot, or 4 different indictments, or the civil suit with E. Jean Carroll, or it's violating the Bill of Rights, the Eighth Amendment, when it says you cannot issue excessive punishment and excessive bail. This idea that he's barred from doing business, he has no mechanism to raise the $355 million, which the judge and the prosecutor upped. They originally were thinking about 250 million until they found out his personal statement said he had 450 million in cash, and they upped it by 100 million. And so I don't think, and we've never seen anything like that.
I mean, that's truly terrifying. Now, they claim that if Trump does get a second term, that he's the next dictator. And just so everyone knows, FDR actually had an affinity for Benito Mussolini before we got involved in World War II. He actually idolized Mussolini to a certain degree. But when we look at it, they keep on claiming that Trump will be the next dictator. Do you think the bureaucracy, as it currently stands, do you believe that they would even let him become anywhere close to a dictator?
Well, that's something that's not a matter of opinion, it's a matter of record. So we have his 4 years, and the question is, did he use the FBI in the fashion of the Obama and Biden administration? By that, I mean, did he send the FBI to school board meetings to hound opponents? Did he use the FBI to hire Twitter censors to suppress information that might be negative to him the way that they did? Did he try to use the CIA to pressure retired CIA officers like Mike Morrell did to lie about the laptop on the EVA debate? Did he try to do that with the CIA? No. Did he try to use the DOJ to go after political enemies with special prosecutors? No, they went after him, actually. So when you look at all of these agencies, did he try to use the Pentagon? Joe Biden said that during the 2020 that he hoped that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs would walk Trump out of the White House. And remember, we had Mark Milley, who said that Trump was so dangerous, he contracted his Chinese counterpart and warned him that he would warn him first before he would accept an order of an existential war issued by his own commander-in-chief. So he didn't do any of that. In fact, he had these administrative states. Remember, we had anonymous minor official in the Homeland Security that they transmogrified into a key cabinet officer who was, they were so proud in the New York Times that he just said that I'm obstructing the Trump executive orders. And we had a very distinguished Admiral McRaven, who wrote 2 op-eds in the New York Times and said that even though we had a scheduled election, he said that Trump should leave sooner the better. And so it was just the opposite. Trump not only didn't use these branches of government to go after political enemies, they themselves freelance and went after him. And yet he didn't even try to have any retribution. He fired some people, but he didn't use these agencies at all.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point to this. Now, when it comes to the bureaucracy, not only are they corrupt, not only has it been ideologically weaponized, but they're also incompetent. And what I mean by that is I look at the Afghanistan war, 20 years of war, almost $2 trillion spent, 2,400 lives lost, soldiers coming home in flag-draped coffins, tens of thousands, life-altering injuries. Throughout that period, we heard that the government of Afghanistan was stable, that the Taliban was on the brink, that the Afghan security forces can hold that government, that we're making progress. Obviously, that was all lies, but not a single government bureaucrat was suspended, demoted, fired, nothing. There was no consequences. Can a country survive when they have a corrupt, ideologically weaponized government that's also incompetent at the same time?
I don't think they can. And remember that Joe Biden announced in April that he was going to get out, and he picked the date. He told the Taliban it's going to be September 11th. And why did he pick that date? Because he was planning an enormous celebration that Joe Biden and only Joe Biden ended this misadventure of 20 years on the iconic date of the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And then we heard the testimony from General McKenzie and General Milley, and it was quite shocking because now, only after it's all over, and only after they both retired, now they confess to us that they knew it wasn't going to work. They knew it was dangerous. They knew that Biden shouldn't do that. They told Biden, and you wanted to say to them, if it was so dangerous, why didn't you resign? Why didn't you have a press conference and say, we're not going to obstruct the president of the United States because we believe in the chain of command, but we can't serve this because Americans are going to get killed. And so therefore we resigned. But now we learn that they claim that they had warned Biden repeatedly that it was suicidal to turn over this type of $50 billion of munitions to the Taliban. 13 people were killed. We don't know how many, according to the testimony yesterday, we don't know how many Afghans were murdered who worked with us. We don't really know how many Americans were there as contractors or how many are still there. And so it was kind of frustrating to hear these people tell us under oath yesterday how awful everything was. But they had that knowledge the whole time in June, July, August. They didn't tell us.
Yeah, well, I think Milley was too busy trying to figure out this white rage thing. And I think that might have been it. He was too distracted. But when we look at Afghanistan, I mean, the Taliban was able to reclaim that country within a week as we're withdrawing. We didn't even leave yet, and they took back the country. We'd asked them permission to leave. But it highlights and reveals the damaging foreign policy of this administration and how dangerous it is, that this may go down as the worst foreign policy decision ever made, because following it, Russia invades Ukraine. China becomes much more aggressive in the Pacific. Iran becomes much more aggressive in the Middle East. Venezuela is now threatening Guyana. You have Hamas and terrorist organizations. Again, you're the one that understands history better than most. Do you think that most of what we're witnessing today and the increasing instability around the world is a direct result from that catastrophic policy decision?
Oh, absolutely. We destroy deterrence. And deterrence means that anybody who wants to be aggressive or belligerent makes a cost to benefit analysis of what is the ups and downside. And when we have deterrence, they decide that the United States is too unpredictable, too powerful. We have no idea what they're going to do. So they behave. And in the case of Ukraine, they invaded when George W. Bush, they went into Ossetia. The Russians did first in 2008, because George W. Bush had about a 28% popularity rating, and he was mired in the Afghan and Iraq wars. And then they went in because of Obama's hot mic speech to tell Vladimir, remember, I'll be flexible on missile defense, i.e. I'll cancel missile defense with Eastern Europe if he'll give me some space, i.e. don't invade during my reelection of 2012. And so then as soon they kept the bargain, both of them did. And then in 2014, Putin invades Donbass and Crimea. Then he does it again on February 24th. He invades, tries to take Kiev of 2024. So of the last four administrations, there's only one in which he did not invade, and that was Donald Trump. And that's the one that he was accused of being a Russian asset when he got out of an asymmetrical missile deal. He killed 200 members of the Wagner group. He sent offensive weapons to Ukraine. I could go on, but we lost deterrence. And Joe Biden had said, remember, to Vladimir Putin, stop hacking. And if you're going to hack, don't hack hospitals and institutions like that. And then when he was asked, what do you think of Putin massing on the border? And he said, it depends on whether it's a major or minor invasion of Ukraine. And then thirdly, when he came into office, I mean, they impeached Donald Trump for supposedly delaying, not canceling, delaying offensive weapons, which Obama had never approved. But the first thing Biden did was he put a hold on $100 million of offensive weapons to Ukraine because he was thought that it might antagonize Putin. When the Chinese sent this balloon over the continental United States for a week, the rhetoric about Taiwan was ratcheted up by them after that, and especially after Afghanistan. When you look at the Middle East, I mean, I don't think the Middle East could believe what was going on, because all of a sudden they were begging to get in the Iran deal. All of a sudden the Houthis were no longer a terrorist organization. All of a sudden Hamas and the P.A. got $700 million that had been cut off. All of a sudden we were told that the Iranians were going to get $10 billion or $6 billion for hostages, 1.2 billion a hostage. And the sanctions were going to be dropped. And that could be, probably gave them 60 to 70 billion in new revenues. So the people in the Middle East looked, and then this was coupled with criticism of the Netanyahu government. So I think people in the Middle East said, you know what? If we do something either Israel won't respond as they usually do because the United States will pressure them, or maybe the United States won't respond if we hit them. So we had 120 attacks on our installations before, and we really haven't responded in a muscular way. So Jake Sullivan said when he inherited his Middle East portfolio, it was a very revealing comment. He said, it's the calmest place in the world. It doesn't worry me. What he was basically saying, whether he knew it or not, is Trump deterred everybody. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He said the Golan Heights are going to be Israeli, the Abrams Accords, where he got out of the Iran deal. He declared the Houthis a terrorist organization.
He took out Soleimani.
He took out Soleimani. He bombed the SHIT out of ISIS. And nobody knew what he was going to do. And so Sullivan and Blinken inherited that. And they were cruising thinking they had a hand in it, and they had no hand. And then they reversed it all. Each item they tried to reverse, and the result was the October 7th massacre.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, like, during my lifetime, I've never seen the Middle East as stable as it was under the Trump administration. It's always been a nightmare, and it was stable.
I know I would talk to journalists at the Hoover Institution that came from the Middle East, or I would have emails from Arab journalists, or I went to Israel twice, and everybody couldn't believe it. And we would ask them, why is it so quiet? And they would say the same thing. They had no idea what Donald Trump was going to do. They did not know what he would do.
And doesn't that say something about that, you know, despite some people may have their issues with his personality flaws, that unpredictable nature. I mean, Trump engaged in high risk, high reward diplomacy, and it was successful. And the unpredictable nature of him is what drove it.
And he had a very weird foreign policy in this sense. And, you know, when I wrote the book, The Case for Trump, I read all of those ghost-written books, The Art of the Deal, The Art of the Comeback, The Art of the Deal 2. And he implemented that philosophy, and it was always to get the better of the other party, but don't rub his nose into it and leave them an out so it doesn't lead to an escalation. And he was doing this in the realm of business. But when he killed Soleimani, he was bragging to a lot of people that, and I've asked people in the administration if it was true, and they said it was, that he said to Soleimani, to the Iranians, they called him up and said, you killed Soleimani, we have a loss of face, we're going to attack you. And he said, if you kill one American, you're going to regret it. We have a list of targets. So then they said, well, we're going to send missiles toward your installations, but keep everybody in the base. They won't kill anybody. They're going to land, and then we can say that we retaliate. And he went along with it. And the point was, and he did the same thing with Rocket Man. He told him he was going to have a bigger button than Rocket Man. Kim Jong-un, you know, back down, and then he didn't rub his face. He didn't rub his nose in it. And Biden does the opposite. He calls Putin a killer or a thug, and then he's weak, or he makes statements, but he's weak. And it's much. Biden is loud and carries a twig, and Trump was quiet and carried a club, and that's the difference.
And taking all this, we look at the end of everything, right? The new book coming out May 7th, again, available for pre-order. When you go through the book and you talk about different civilizations, okay, different periods of time and how nations ultimately destroyed themselves. Do you see any parallels throughout history and what's happening today?
I do, and I talk about in the epilogue. So I looked at ancient Thebes and Carthage and Constantinople and the Aztec capital, Aztec civilization at Tenochtitlan, modern Mexico City. And there's a pattern that all of these were grandiose civilizations, states, and they had massive walls, they had a lot of allies, but they weren't attuned to the erosion of their power. In other words, Carthage had lost 2 wars, but they said, you know, the Romans never would destroy Carthage. They didn't do it in the First Punic War. They didn't do it in the Second. Nobody's ever breached the walls. They had no estimation of the relative deterioration in their own strength vis-a-vis their opponents, or they thought, even if we get in a war, they would never think of doing this, or we have allies that will help us, or these people are on the same page as. They had no idea who Scipio Aemilianus was, or Alexander the Great, or Hernan Cortez. So when you look at the United States, I think people still say, well, we spend more on defense than any other country, and they don't say, yeah, but it's for pensions and it's for non-military usage.
8-month maternity flight suits.
Exactly. And you look at the shipbuilding program of the Chinese, their increase in the Air Force. And then you think, well, these people wouldn't, we say to every day, we say, well, Putin threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons again. Or somebody in the Russian parliament said they're going to, I counted them in the book, there were 14 of them when I finished the manuscript, threats. But they didn't understand that if you sink the Black Sea Fleet and you put, as Macron once has said, put NATO troops on the soil, you don't know what Putin is going to do. You don't know what he's going to do. And we know what we did when we had a sphere of influence that I think was less connected with Cuba in 1962 than Ukraine was with Russia. But we said Cuba, even though it had gone communist, is still subject to the Monroe Doctrine. So when they had this communist-inspired revolution in 59, and then in 62, they had medium-range missiles pointed at us, and we thought they had nuclear weapons on them. We just told Russia, we're going to put a blockade around Cuba, and if you try to break the blockade, we're going to sink your ships, and we have more nuclear weapons than you do. And they made a deal, but they did basically back down. And I think we got very close to DEFCON 5, that we know now historically. So we don't know what people will do in these situations, but the idea that Russia won't go crazy if they feel NATO is on the ground in Ukraine, and people have talked about that, not just Macron. And we're getting to a point now where there's, and I talk about that in the book, we had 700,000 casualties in Ukraine and Russia combined. That's bigger than the Battle of Verdun. And at some point, we're going to get probably by the end of the year up to 1 million people killed or wounded on both sides. And Ukraine has lost 12 million people. So what I'm fascinated by or worried about is nobody in NATO has said, Russia now has 3 to 4 times the population, 10 times the GDP, 30 times the territory, and there's 700,000 dead or wounded, and 12,000 Ukrainians have left the country. And how do we stop this juggernaut? And what is the plan? And I'm fine for arming Ukraine, but this idea we're going to have a spring offensive last year, and they're going to go against a Maginot Line that's 600 miles long and a mile wide with anti-tank weapons and mines and drones, the smaller power, and it was a disaster. And yet I don't think we take seriously, that's what I'm trying to say about the book, tries to suggest to you that declining powers get into a framework that they're still powerful and they're still popular and they still have allies, and the enemy wouldn't dare think of the existential. And yet, when you look at the world today, there's a lot of places, and I name them, and I look at Cyprus, I look at Greece, I look at Armenia, I look at the Kurds, I look at Israel, and in every one of those cases, their bellicose neighbor, especially Turkey under Mr. Erdogan, but also Iran, has threatened to wipe them out. Mr. Erdogan said about 6 months ago that if Greece didn't cooperate in the Mediterranean about overflights, meaning let us overfly their islands, and they're going to wake up one day and they're going to see a rain of Turkish missiles fall on Athens.
Yeah, and that's a NATO ally.
That's a NATO ally, absolutely.
And I think with the whole Russia-Ukraine thing, you actually see the incompetence within our government, right? I mean, the reality is that 3 months into the war, Russia was hurt. Their economy was reeling. Their military did suffer. So Russia lost power and influence. That would have been the time to force a settlement. Putin wanted an out. We could have given him one. Then Russia is weaker. They're a weaker adversary. That benefits us. And we have a Ukraine where we dictate their policies to because we give them so much money in military aid. Instead, you have these idiots in the policymaking arena saying, no, Ukraine could actually win this thing. Meanwhile, every war has shown that nations adapt to the battlefield. They learn from their failures.
Especially the Russians have whether it's Napoleon or Hitler or the Finnish War or the Polish War, they always start out bad, and they don't do well if they send their armies across the world to Japan in 1905, or they try to go on expeditionary, but when you get close to the Russian border and you fight the Russians for all their incompetence and all the death and destruction you can inflict on them, they wear you down. And that's what's happening. It's typical. And there was a brief moment when they had saved Kiev and the Russians lost horrendous casualties. And Zelensky was even thinking of some kind of settlement along the lines of, well, the Donbass and Crimea have Russian-speaking majorities, and no American administration, not Barack Obama, who lost them, basically didn't do anything, and not Donald Trump, and not Joe Biden have ever said before this latest war, we're going to get them back. You know, Ukraine, they never said that. And I don't think they're ever going to get them back. And given the checkered history of those borders, they had been Russian since 1783, and only in 1993 did Crimea declare itself an independent republic. And then Ukraine snatched it because they thought if they didn't grab it, then Russia would grab it. But the point I'm making is there was according to Zelensky and some people in our own military, there was a mechanism where we had really punished Russia, and we were never going to have the wherewithal to get them out of the Donbass. They'd been there a decade, or get them out of Crimea. But we could have negotiated and said, we will not put Ukraine in NATO, but we're going to arm it to the teeth. We're going to arm it to the tooth. So they're going to do real damage again if you try to invade them. And we will institutionalize what you had before the war, Crimea and Donbass. But you got to get back to the February 24th embarkation point where you invaded. And I think that they would have done that. They were reeling. And then Putin could have gone back to his people and said, well, I invaded. I know that I didn't take Kiev, and I've got to go back to where I started. But now there's no question that Crimea and the Donbass really have been ours for a decade, and they will be ours. And I think we could have deterred him then, because he really had suffered a lot. But at that point, Ukraine had not suffered a lot. They hadn't lost 250,000 casualties. So we pushed that.
Like Afghanistan, Russia is more powerful today than it was prior to the invasion. And so one final question, particularly within the context of the end of everything, and this is really about Western civilization. Do you think that there is a way to stop all these self-inflicted wounds, particularly the self-hatred that's being instilled amongst the population, where you have all these kids going to school and learning how their society and Western culture is this horrible culture, and they're colonizers, they're racist, they're abusive? Is there a way to fix this, or are we just going to be like all the other empires that existed prior to ours, and we're just going to die out soon? Do you think there's a way and a will to actually get to a point where we get back to the concepts of limited government, the Constitution, Western values, Western ideals?
Well, these have been long-standing problems we were eroding, but I think I'm a little optimistic, because I think what really turned the corner in a negative fashion was the George Floyd riots, the COVID, and I think they wouldn't have occurred to the degree they did if it hadn't been for the COVID lockdown, which was an utter disaster. And then the paranoia about Donald Trump. And if they lose the next election, the left, and if they lose the Senate and they lose in the House, there's going to be a radical pushback. And I think if the Republicans can stay united and they can unite, and Donald Trump's not in jail, there's a lot of ifs, but from what they're talking about, they will close the border and they will deport. You don't have to deport 8 million people. All you have to do is deport 5,000 and say, you're next, and create deterrence, and people will start to get self-deporting. If you're serious, and if they can build up the military and try to cut back on the entitlements, get to a balanced budget, they have a chance to do it. And I think, but they can't do it unless, the problem with the Republican Party is that, and I saw what I'm referencing Mike Pence the other day, said that he was vice president. They had a great 4 years, but he won't vote for Donald Trump because he's now not as conservative. But everything Donald Trump has said he'd do is exactly what he did the 4 years ago. So Pence has other reasons, that personality of Trump, January, whatever. But what Pence and people like Pence are basically saying is, I have to have a perfect conservative or it's not going to be good. All he has to say is, I have reservations about Donald Trump, but compared to the Biden socialist agenda, if I get 51% of what I want, it's better than the alternative. And so that's the problem that the right has right now. They don't understand the existential threat that this leftist movement, it's not the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton. It's not even the Democratic Party of Obama. Obama himself is liberated now to run things via Joe Biden in a way that he wouldn't have dared when he was accountable. And I don't think people realize what these people are up to. It's not that the border is porous. It doesn't exist. It's not that they're light on crime. They don't think it's a crime to smash and grab or to hit somebody or to loot. It's not that they're ambiguous about fossil fuels. They want to eliminate them now. It's not that they don't believe in deterrence, that they really believe that Iran might be a valuable ally in the Middle East, or that China is not really a threat to us. So these are different types of people. We've never dealt with people like this before. And I think they have to be defeated at the polls, and it's going to be very difficult given 70% of the electorate now suddenly in this revolutionary movement since 2020 do not vote on election day, and they get mail-in ballots, from the DMV or the disability office, and there's no way to authenticate them. And yet the Republicans are just going to have to turn out in mass. They're going to have to unite, and if they can stop it, they can do something. But if they can't, I'm very pessimistic. Joe Biden would, a second term, there'd be no check on these people.
No, they would be off the walls. And hopefully Republicans are smart enough to realize that, about 40% of their electorate doesn't even come out in presidential elections. And maybe you should start talking to those people and get them out to the polls, because that will guarantee a victory.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Dr. Hanson, always enjoy the conversation, the end of everything, and have it up on the website. People can link to your website from my website. And it really is fascinating. Good luck with the book.
Thank you for having me.